Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Geopolitička važnost Arktika je sve veća. Zbog otapanja leda otvaraju se sjevernozapadni prolazi, Sjevernomorska ruta i buduća Transpolarna morska ruta koja bi znatno olakšala prijevoz robe iz Evrope prema Aziji i Americi. Potrebe za novim izvorima energenata neprestano rastu, a Arktik je nova meta geopolitičkog nadmetanja, jer su procjene da se tamo nalazi 15% neiskorištenih zaliha prirodnog plina i 30% neiskorištenih zaliha nafte, kao i ogromne količine ribe i minerala na tlu mora. Ruska federacija je uspostavila nove i modernizovala stare vojne baze u sjevernim regijama. Unaprijedila je status svoje sjeverne flote na vojni okrug i povećala kapacitete različitih grana oružanih snaga opremljenih između ostalog novim podmornicama, nuklearnim ledolomcima, borbenim radarima i raketnim sistemima. Oživjela je i sovjetski koncept bastionske odbrane, usmjeren na zaštitu strateških kapaciteta od Barencovog mora do Beringovog moreuza. Kako na sve intenzivnije vojne aktivnosti Rusije gleda Finska, koja sa tom zemljom dijeli granicu dugo 1300 km, pojašnjava nam Juhana Aunesloma, profesor političke historije na Univerzitetu u Helsinkiju. So, Professor Johanna, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Russia has thus far shown interest in occupying parts of the former Soviet Union. Finland was never part of the USSR, but it was a part of Tsarist Russia for some time. What makes you think Moscow still has irredentist aspirations towards this country?
Well, I don't think it has. And I don't think the general opinion in Finland either has that view that Russia today is motivated by restoring the Tsarist empire as it was before 1917. We tend to think that Russia's kind of security concerns are they of course have a historical grounding and they have their own historical understanding of Russia's place, but they are much more contemporary concerns than just to restore an empire that effectively was lost in the Bolshevik Revolution and only partially restored by the Soviet Union. So we're not particularly worried about Russians or Putin trying to restore what they had in 1917. It may be that we are somewhat more concerned about the attempts to restore what the Soviet Union had.
In what sense do you mean?
The Soviet Union, of course, had its own system of how it used power in the world, but also in Europe. And in the time of the Soviet Union, Finland, of course, had a very special place in the Soviet security system, and it was very closely tied from the 1940s to all the way to the end of the Soviet Union to what the Soviet Union wanted in the security sphere.
Mm-hmm. Now, given Finland's 1,300-kilometer long border with Russia, its policy of neutrality during the Cold War, will accession to NATO represent a significant geopolitical realignment with yet unknown implications for this country and for Russia and for Russia's defense doctrine as a whole?
Well, the way Finnish security policy has changed recently looks very dramatic. It looks very sudden what has happened this year, but actually there's a much longer and slower change that has been underway already for some decades in Finland. Of course, I don't want to kind of understate the significance of the decision this year to join NATO, but Finland has been closely aligned with NATO already before in a very close partnership that has actually gradually intensified all the way from the 2000s and 2010s.
I mean,
to
it
the
uses
present day.
NATO-grade weapons. It's very interoperable with NATO troops.
Exactly. So there's been a gradual alignment of Finland towards NATO since the 1990s. And Finland's relationship with the United States has grown gradually closer as well. So there's a much more gradual change that has been underway for quite some time now, and now it has culminated this year with NATO membership, when Finland has been in a way forced to choose sides by Russia. And then it has fully aligned with NATO.
Despite these ongoing tensions between the two countries, I mean, official cooperation with Russia continues in terms of cross-border security, transportation safety, tourism, travel, trade, and so on and so forth. Talk us through your present-day cooperations with Russia.
Well, the fact that Finland and Russia share a long border, that in many ways automatically places demands on the governments to how to manage the border in a safe and secure way. So neighboring countries can really never stop their relations if there are flows across the border, as there is at the moment. But that kind of collaboration is administrative collaboration. It's between authorities on the ground. There's very little going on the higher political level between Finland and Russia due to the circumstances where we are now. But handling and managing the border is kind of day-to-day business, where the authorities have to have some kind of agreements how they behave on both sides. But that interaction as a whole, of course, has weakened significantly. Hence, there's less need to do this day-to-day management of the relationship.
There are growing concerns about also the safety of undersea cables, which carry about 99% of all digital data worldwide. Islands such as Åland and Gotland are seen as key cable relay stations in the Baltics. Some security analysts have suggested that Russia may even go as far as to invade those islands. Do you see that as being far-fetched?
Well, that would be only in a situation where there's already a significant military conflict going on in the region, because that would actually be a very dramatic step, and with Finland and Sweden in NATO, and already covered by security guarantees from the UK government, and also the understanding between the Americans and these countries, that would actually trigger a very significant military conflict. So the threshold for any operations like that would be quite high. But in a case of a military conflict in the region, the Åland Islands and the Gotlands would be right in the middle of the contestation. These are strategically very important places.
What about the Kola Peninsula? How important is that for Russia?
Well, that Kola Peninsula has a global significance.
In what sense?
Russia. It's the base of Russia's Arctic fleet, and most importantly, its nuclear deterrence. Mm-hmm. So the Kola Peninsula is one of the most important strategic, if not the most important strategic pieces of real estate in Russia, because it houses Russia's nuclear deterrence. The Arctic fleet, it's an open water port, and it's very significant. Its significance goes way beyond its significance in Northern Europe. It has global significance. I would say the Baltic Sea region still is less important in Russian eyes than the Kola Peninsula in the high north. But that situation there has been quite stable already for quite many decades. Norway was one of the original members of NATO when the alliance was created in the beginning of the Cold War, and they've been handling, the Norwegians and the Russians are quite used to handling their relationship in the high north, and agreeing also on the uses of the resources in the Arctic Sea and so forth on. So there's a tradition and there's a system of how to manage that part of the world that is in place. Now we have to learn how to manage the Baltic Sea region when Finland and Sweden are joining NATO and the tensions are so high between Russia and the West.
Now, I mean, when you look at things back from the last 20 years, how do you make sense of all this? I mean, back in 1999, President Bush and former President Clinton had been speaking to Putin about the possibility of Russia even joining the alliance. And now we have gone to things have turned around to such an extent that we haven't been in a worse situation since the height of the Cold War.
Exactly. So this is a really important question. I don't think there is anything predetermined in where we are at the moment. That means that I don't think that there were anything done after the Cold War and when the Soviet Union collapsed and in the 1990s that there were anything done then that would actually lead into where we are today. So I think we should not look for the mistakes made in the 1990s or perhaps 20 years ago. I think it's more important than what has happened over the last 15 years or so in Russia, within Russia, and also with Russia's relationship with the rest of the world. Russia has changed more than the West. And this is, I think, important in understanding where we are. Russians were never happy about the way things turned out after the Soviet Union collapsed, but that would not automatically in any way lead into this kind of conflict where we are at the moment. So something has happened in the 2000s and in the 2010s that has made Russians and the Russian leadership to look to the West and see more threats than opportunities there.
With all these Western sanctions slapped onto Russia, we see Russia talking about intensifying its cooperation with the Chinese. Do you think these Western responses will inadvertently push Russia into Beijing's hug, into Beijing's orbit?
Well, they already are quite close to each other. Russia and China already have a fairly close partnership, but that's not a partnership without its own internal tensions either. And it's not a partnership of equals. But China's economic power is immense.
It's very asymmetrical.
It's asymmetric. It's an asymmetrical relationship what China and Russia have, and that kind of an asymmetrical relationship is really difficult to manage. It's really difficult on the long run to keep it going and to see the world in pretty much in the same way. And but it also may be that given the tensions that we are now having in the world, this partnership may become closer. But I'm not sure whether actually it might go in the way as the leaders earlier this year said, that it has no limits. I think it might have limits, but we don't yet know where those limits are.
Right, Professor, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you for having me.
Od početka 1960-ih Finska je provodila politiku države blagostanja sa naglašenim udjelom javnog sektora. Međutim, u 1990-im radikalno je izmijenila svoj ekonomski koncept. Najveći utjecaj na taj zaokret imala je unutrašnja liberalizacija tržišta potkraj 1980-ih, a zatim i raspad Sovjetskog saveza kao dotad glavnog vanjsko-trgovinskog partnera, te finska orijentacija prema Europskoj uniji. Još 1995. Finska je pristupila Uniji, ali trgovinski odnosi sa Rusijom i dalje su bliski. Detalje o važnosti Rusije kao trgovinskog partnera Finskoj te o političkim odnosima dvije zemlje pojašnjava nam Heikki Patomäki, direktor Helsinškog koledža za napredne studije. So, Professor, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to speak to us. Now, has Russia historically viewed the Scandinavian peninsula as a natural barrier to the open ocean? And was the continued neutrality of Finland and Sweden regarded as a geopolitical requirement for Russia's survival in a way?
Well, survival is a very strong term here in this context, but obviously the Baltic Sea as well as the Kolan Peninsula have been very important for Russia, as well as both were very important for the Soviet Union as well. Finland and Sweden are here somewhat different because, as you may know, Finland used to be part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century until the First World War and the Russian Revolution. But in the sense of geopolitical positioning, here Finland in particular is very close to the many centers of Russia. St. Petersburg is only about 250 kilometers from Helsinki or so, and the Kolan Peninsula is equally very close to the Finnish border, and that is the most important naval base for Russia. And even Moscow is not that far away, even though it's much closer from the Ukrainian border, but I mean it's still only 1 hour and a half by flight to Moscow. But what really matters is the social construction of geopolitics here. I mean, how do you visualize, how do you see a particular space in terms of geopolitical considerations and those kinds of things? And during the Cold War, Finland was not only some kind of a buffer zone between the two military alliances, and that was also the official doctrine of the Finnish military at the time as well, and defense policy. But Finland was also a very important cooperative partner for the Soviet Union. I mean, the trade between Finland and the Soviet Union was much more extensive and intensive as well than any trade between any Western country and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And at one point, I mean, the imports and exports with Soviet Union, I mean, constituted almost like 1/4 of the Finnish exports. So that was quite important. And it was also extremely beneficial for Finland, but also the Soviets saw it in the same way. So that changed the situation in a way that I don't think that geopolitics mattered that much anymore in the 1970s and 1980s. Of course, the geopolitics did matter, but not in the same way as in the earlier decades. And then came the end of the Cold War and the 1990s, the chaos in Russia. So on both sides, I mean, it was very difficult to decide what the story is that we are following. I mean, what will come out of Russia from this side? And then on the Russian side, I mean, the question was also how to see your relations to the West. I mean, there was discussion in the early 1990s about the possibility of Russia actually joining the European Union. And even in the early 2000s, I mean, when Putin first rose to power.
There was talk about Russia joining NATO as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and still in the early 2000s, I mean, in year 2000 and 2001, Putin actually had discussions with Bush and also Clinton about the possibility of Russia joining the NATO. But the Americans were not particularly willing to accept the idea of parity and equality between the two countries, right. And the Russian membership would have changed the whole thing, and so it was made very quickly quite clear to Russia that this is not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then started all kinds of other things. The war in Iraq was quite important. Right. Then the color revolutions, I mean, in Georgia, in Ukraine. And so on. So that changed the whole thing, and all of a sudden the continuities from the Cold War started to take over. We have to remember, though, that all the time through the 1990s as well, I mean, there was the nuclear deterrence factor. Right. And what are the Russian nuclear weapons for? They are basically a deterrence against the nuclear weapons of other countries, most important of them being the United States of America. Right? So this aspect of the Cold War deterrence and geopolitics was always there. It never disappeared entirely. And then after, it was like decided that Russia is not going to be part of the European Union, or it is not going to be part of NATO either. And there were all kinds of alienating factors, including the Chechen war. There were other things on the Russian side, and then Iraq war and the color revolutions. And then they started to become the relations more hostile. And this, in a way, meant a return of geopolitics in the northern hemisphere, in the northern part of Europe as well.
But going back to 1991, from the Russian perspective, the collapse of the USSR, with the collapse of the USSR, a downsized Russia lost its perceived security buffer zone with the West. Is President Putin now trying to regain that buffer zone by creating frozen conflicts in Georgia, in Ukraine, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps in Moldova?
Well, that would be a simplification in my view. On the one hand, what we have seen is the expansion of NATO and also the European Union eastwards. So from the Russian point of view, it's not like there was a kind of a stable buffer zone, but rather the buffer zone has been diminished over time. And it was also something that might be happening in the future as well. There was this Bucharest Declaration of 2008 by NATO that Ukraine and Georgia are going to be future members of NATO. And that was seen as a provocation in Moscow. And even though the Georgian war in 2008 cannot be reduced to that issue, but it was a factor behind the war in Georgia. So, and then in 2014, in similarly, I mean, in the context of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, and also the fleeing of Yanukovych and all the rest of it, in the context of a political economic crisis in Ukraine at that time, and then struggle over different loans and loan conditions. I mean, the European Union offering this loan, but with conditions of austerity, Moscow offering another loan with less conditions, but with other political strings tied to it. And there was struggle within Ukraine, and in that context, I mean, the war started in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine first. I mean, separatism, the Crimean thing, and so on and so forth. And this was clearly motivated by these more general developments, return of geopolitics, NATO expansion, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I don't like the term buffer zone, and I don't think that this is exactly the term that is very often being used by the Russians either. But it tells you something about the situation. I mean, there were certain vulnerabilities and certain insecurities on the Russian side as well, that on top of everything else, I mean, there were internal changes in Russia. The society was becoming less democratic and more hierarchical and those kinds of things. So securitization connected the two things. So what the West did and how it was perceived in Russia fed into the processes inside Russia, in the domestic politics of Russia, and vice versa. And this is a very complicated system and thing. But I think that a lot of responsibility lies on the Western side, the unthoughtful way of expanding NATO in particular, but also to a degree the European Union on certain unilateral conditions. I mean, I find that a key cause of the complex.
Now, Professor, given Finland's 1,300 kilometer long border with Russia, its policy of neutrality during the Cold War, will accession to NATO represent a significant geopolitical alignment with yet perhaps unknown implications in the long run for this country?
Well, I mean, that is correct. It changes a lot. Obviously, the closeness of Finland to Russia and this long border with Russia.
NATO's border with Russia will be doubled.
Indeed. So the situation is such that any country in the situation of Russia would have to reconsider their military doctrines and strategies and so on and so forth. And this is obviously what is happening. In Finland, there was a lot of talk about something more threatening in the short run. But what I think was to happen and is happening at the moment is precisely this more strategic rethinking about the situation once Finland and Sweden are inside NATO. And I think Russia probably both in political economy terms and also in security terms has to become more Asian, if you like. The West has come closer. But then on the other hand, there's nothing they can do about the position of Moscow and St. Petersburg, or even the Kolan Peninsula and the access of Russia to the northern seas. And so those are important factors that can't be very easily changed. Whereas geography cannot be changed. The way they are perceived and how they are socially constructed can be changed. But it requires an entirely different context to see that something very cooperative could come out of the current situation.
How do you make sense of Turkey's demands when it comes to Finland's accession to NATO And do you see any justification whatsoever in Ankara's requests to have certain individuals extradited from Finland and from Sweden as well?
Well, there are different interpretations about the actions of Turkey. I mean, to the extent that there is something that is more based on a kind of a common interest in precisely avoiding the division of the world into two camps, in avoiding the pushing Russia entirely out of the scene or out of the map. That there's some kind of a peace interest behind the attempt to slow down the process of Finland and Sweden accessing NATO. To that extent, I can understand it. But in terms of human rights, I find it difficult to accommodate the Finnish and Swedish tradition of social democracy based on very strong notion of human rights with this kind of an attitude that we are willing to compromise to the extent that even the most fundamental and basic principles of these countries are threatened. It should be a kind of a democratic thing to decide within these countries, I mean, how they view certain actors in the Middle Eastern conflicts. And the situation of Kurds has been a minority that has been repressed in all kinds of ways. I know that there has been violence on both sides. It's a complicated thing, and so on and so forth. All conflicts are. But nonetheless, I don't think that simply by siding with Ankara at this point is a particularly good thing for Finland or Sweden in the longer run.
Does Finland have any choice in this case?
Yes, of course you have choice. I mean, the thing is how desperate you are to get to NATO.
And how desperate is Finland to get to NATO?
Very, at the moment, very desperate.
Professor, thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you.
Geoekonomska važnost Arktika brzo raste zbog sve većeg interesa za njegove bogate i obilne prirodne resurse, uključujući i kritične sirovine, te za nove pomorske rute i potencijal za pomorski prijevoz. Stabilnost Arktika relativno je dobro očuvana, ali na nju sve više utječu rastući međunarodni interesi te promjene u sigurnosnom okruženju, što uključuje i ponovnu militarizaciju. Tu prednjači Rusija, čija su ekonomska i vojna ulaganja na Arktiku mnogo veća od ulaganja ostalih država.